Boa tarde a todas e todos.
Good morning, everyone.
Iniciamos a segunda sessão do nosso
We're going to
ensaio
start this second
Memórias
session
do Capitalismo,
of this preparatory seminar, Memories of Capitalism, developed by the Laboratory of Studies and the Uses of Study of the Past and Observatory of Memory, the EUOM. The cultural transformations, cultural and social transformations that began in the 20th century, together with authoritarianism and violence, changed relationships that were established towards the past and time, implying new approaches about memory, forgiveness, and temporality. On the one hand, we can see that memory, it is a duty, creating abuse situations such as tyranny and loads of troubles. And on the other hand, as time went by, we felt stagnated in this present moment in time. In this new environment, we can see that there is a discrepancy amongst the discourses and memory representations from a political and ideology perspective. As for the memories and the victims of a communist experiences are named, there is a lack of the knowledge and recognition of capitalism victims and the memoirs of capitalism also in during fascism. In order to create a capitalism and also to mention the role that this, we must bear in mind that we do have a broader perspective of capitalism, and the normativity has been spread all over the dimensions of life, having an impact with past and with time. Trends of capitalism, abstraction, as well as acceleration and alienation and naturalization. In a nutshell, they showcase a civilization as a producer of inequalities, hierarchies, and human rights violations. These trends create a detemporalization of the system that at the same time finally created a memory of capitalism as an absence, as silence, and also as something that has been hidden in an explicit manner when it was not mentioned and recognized. The four main thematic axes today we're going to talk about colonialism, memories, and imperialism, and also neoliberalism, capitalism, and its victims. We do have amongst us Víctor Barros, researchers at Casa Velázquez in Spain, Celeste Muñoz, professor at the University Nacional of Distance Education in Spain, Rodrigo Turin of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and also Gabriel Gatt. Unfortunately, due to professional duties, Silvia Correia from University of Porto is not today with us. Therefore, myself, Carolina Bauer, member of the group and professor at the University of Rio Grande do Sul, I'm going to moderate both panels. We will have these first two presentations, and after we will have a very short debate. And after that, we will have the next two presentations of table number 2. I'd like to ask our presenters to respect the 15-20 minutes, the time that have been allocated. And also, we will go until 4:30 p.m. here in Brazil. We will have at the most 2.5 hours. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Víctor Barros. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. Thank you for being with us and to open this debate about colonialism, memories of colonialism and imperialism. Thank you very much, Víctor. You have the floor. Good afternoon. Welcome to you. Thank you for being with us. First of all, I must be deeply thankful for the invitation that you made me and to share some of my main research interests and also to connect my perspective or my work together with other authors and thinkers that were invited in this panel. As I mentioned, I'm very, very sorry because I will have to leave earlier due to logistic issues, and I'm at the university, and my university closed earlier than expected. And also, I'm abroad, so I do ask you, well, I hope that I won't cause any problem because I won't be during the second session of this debate. Unfortunately, I'd love to be there, but in any case, I'd like to have a conversation with you all, my dear colleagues, and the rest of participants that will be in the next panel. All right. My presentation will deal mainly with the issue, and maybe it's the pivotal center and the discussion, which are memories of imperial capitalism. And I'm going to talk about imperial capitalism, always trying to offer you these fundamental resources that to me are essential, that belong to the repertoire of memories of imperialism, capitalism, such as historical commemorations and colonial monuments. All along my presentation, I thought about taking into account some of the starting points that will be important for further discussion suggested in the program. So, how can we see the differing hierarchy practices and classification practices, and how we went through this memory of capitalism and how it is supported this memory. The second part of my presentation would be how the spatialization and territorialization developed by a colonial metropolis and empires showcase colonialism, and thirdly, how contemporary movements were able to manage and also to create these colonial monuments in the public space, and how to question these monuments as a counter memory against capitalism. All right. In any case, I think that there is a very narrow relationship amongst the commemorations, history commemorations, and colonial monuments, and also the way we wrote history and how we invented the concept of colony and how colonies were created and in the end it's based. And this really shows us how these historical commemorations and colonial monuments help us to better understand memories of capitalism, loads of symbolic memories as well as material memories, that's something that we can touch, that are more concrete and specific and more real. Therefore, this aspect is much more important. This invention of a colony and how commemorations and colonial monuments work, it's very relevant if we take into account, if we put our focus and we pay attention to the memory of the explorers, mainly men that were considered as the builders and creators of the empire. As a starting point, as a main focus, we take these public commemorations and colonial monuments. My presentations will be quite critical when thinking about these monuments and commemorations play a vital role, and they create the memory of imperial colonialism memories, such as the buildings that were built in the colonies in order to glorify the explorers and also the discoverers, between brackets. They act on the construction of the public memory, the so-called discovery, between brackets, as a language of the imperial capitalism. So monuments and commemorations erase the importance of the time and also the interpretation protocols on the territories that were transformed in colonies. So, memory of capitalism creates founding narratives and biased to legitimate the uh, e- colonial exploration, and the monuments that were offered to the explorers and discoverers that colonial had a vital role when producing this memory. Also, the execution processes of commemorations and the monuments, and also the maintenance of the commemorations and monuments, they are inherent parts of the machinery of imperial capitalism. Ceremonies, discourses, commemoration speeches, monuments, and processes when naming the people that were discovered, in between brackets, how they were superior in a nutshell. And they really showcase and underline to me the colonial concept of discoveries, making that any kind of reference and the resistance, local populations had a very important role to play. So the agency of promoters of these commemorations and monuments, as well as the influence of the cultural circulation of ideas and artifacts between metropolis and the colony are also important elements to be taken into account because we, inside this construction process of memories of capitalism, we cannot see the colony or the metropolis something distant and separated as isolated spaces. They must be seen more than a geography. Colony, in the end, it is a relationship space. A colony is not a geography, it is a relationship with populations and also the territories where these populations live. So, in this sense, the cultural circulation of ideas and artifacts between metropolis and the colony is a great element in order to understand the constitution processes of the memories of capitalism inside this imperial relationship with populations that were under the power. In this sense, the central argument of this presentation can be stated as follows. What the promoters of a colonial memory and the ones that commemorate establish as the official history of the discoveries between brackets or the conquest is an arbitrary imposition of facts and narratives of domination. Therefore, commemorations and colonial monuments were inside the context of this imperial relationship were integral resources for the powers image policy, colonial powers image policy, the function for the population, but also the commemoration and events and also the monuments were not only aesthetic. Monuments and commemorations, they represented in instruments for legitimizing imperial power and colonizing imaginaries. Thus, everything together, all this analysis wants to nurture this divide. And also, this debate has to be seen and analyzed. Monuments and commemoration events are key and pieces of the memories of imperial capitalism. So, in order to understand why I'm insisting on this dimension and looking commemorations in colonies and colonial monuments, we must understand the historical genealogy of certain monuments within the framework of imperial exploitation, but also to look at the commemorative policies that establish these monuments. Monuments are interrelated with the commemoration policies. Only in this way, with this monument production and the interaction of these artifices and the products of imperial capitalism, we will be able to understand that whether commemorations as well as monuments, they produce and they create new products of imperial capitalism, nurturing on the one hand the politics of colonial memory and also the cultural circulation, as I said before, as of ideas and objects between the metropolis and the territories transformed into colonies, and also they are ready to establish and also creating this Eurocentric and colonial concept of the idea of discovery, and also they are able to get connected with the public uses of the past and the political manipulation of the history of European expansion for the purposes of global domination. These resources, commemorations, as well as colonial monuments, they are able to get articulated with the modes of appropriation of the public space of the territories converted into colonies, and they are also useful or they are able to connect with the writing of the history, of the narrative of the history, always from the narrated from the repertoire of memorial references imposed by the colonizers. So, if we place this way, this issue, commemorations and monuments were two instruments for fabricating and disseminating a certain conception of the national and imperial history of the colonizing power. For example, the monument was useful, among other things, to connect the colonized people with the past of the first navigators, and at the same time served as a legacy for future generations who could continue to glorify the history of imperial domination. This is why both commemorations and monuments are living and consequential archives of colonial and imperial capitalism. For example, the function of colonial monuments was more than to materialize the representation of the past and to leave traces in the space of the process of colonization. The goal of colonial monuments was to publicize the masculine figure of the discoverer and explorer and to legitimize the promoters of colonial memory as the heirs of a history that began always with the discovery between brackets, disregarding previous historicities and temporalities, as well as the memories and the mnemonic cosmologies of the peoples of the invaded territories. Thus, the monument had to generate a cognitive effects and induce in the population a sense of belonging, a belonging based on the history that was founded by explorers, not the history of the memory of the ancestors of those territories. Because the figure of the discoverer, between brackets, as um, Antonio Correa de Silva, the historian, argues, the role of the discoverer is equivalent to the founder of a new lineage. Him, he marks the beginning and starting point. In this sense, the discovery between brackets becomes a question of identity, which means that the new land that supposedly was discovered is tributary to the identity of the discoverer, not tributary to the identity of the populations that lived in those territories before they were discovered between brackets. Therefore, the monument to the discoverer was a political and cultural artifact that, on the one hand, gave visibility to the version imposed as the official story of the so-called discovery, and, on the other, gave public authority to the promoters of that same story, because the monument is imposed as a visible symbol with narrative authority. By stimulating the remembrance of the idea of discovery and exploration, the statue, the monument, indirectly reinforced the machinery of colonization, and it helped to renew the day-to-day life of colonial domination because the statue and the monument was being integrated into the daily life of the colonized population and into the power relations run by the dominant colonial institutions. Therefore, the signs chosen for the commemorations and monuments reveal how commemorations, they are able to modify this space through the public uses of the history of the metropolis for the purpose of colonial and imperial domination. And they reveal how the production of commemorative artifacts and mnemonic devices were used to colonize the political imagination and to influence people's visions of possibilities, populations that were colonized. According to Catherine Kokri Bidrovich, the knowledge of generated by colonial discourse shaped the interpretation of the history of colonized populations. And this knowledge, with the repertoire of writings and images and monuments produced under colonialism, belong to what Valentin Mudimbe called the colonial library. So, researching this colonial library and critically analyzing the type of knowledge generated as well as the effects and legacies of this knowledge, both in the societies that experience colonization as well as in the former metropoles, it is crucial, it is vital for a more inclusive understanding of the multiple dimensions and aspects of colonialism and also about the memory of colonialism in, let's say, in a broader way. So, in conclusion, glorifying male figures of imperial expansion reinforced the imperial nationalism of the colonizing powers. The commemorations establish figures designated as discoverers, between brackets, disseminated their images, built monuments, created the colonial and Eurocentric concept of discovery, and disseminated a type of narrative that had to be accepted and remembered as the only legitimate version of history. Therefore, the monuments to the so-called discoverers were not and are not the story of the discovery. They are political and cultural devices produced with the purpose of strengthening the authority of the dominant power and nourishing the day-to-day life of colonial domination. Therefore, commemoration and monuments were political instruments and aesthetic resources designed to subjugate the colonized with the historical narratives of the metropolis. On the one hand, because monuments and commemorations, they spread a message and a codified colonial language that established the protocol of starting the narration of time, history, and action, always from the memory of the so-called discoverers and the agency of the colonizers. On the other hand, the monuments as well as the commemorations, they create for the population an edifying perspective of the history of the colonizing metropolis, while silencing other pasts, as well as the places, roles, and contribution of the colonized in the production of world history. And in order to answer the three questions that you made, trying to give you a very succinct answer and to have some items to think about, once we look to the colonial monuments, and I'm answering to the first question, how to understand the classification and hierarchization of human beings and how they express a capitalism and what would be the support. To me, the monuments and commemorations, they are rendering a clear idea, the idea that those were the figures of the memory from the monuments, from the public status, but also who was commemorated, what was the history behind of that individual, and the sense of superiority of the people connected with the narrative that had to be commemorated. So, hierarchy of racial capitalism is tightly related with commemorations, and commemorations, they build the history of a colonizers, always masculine colonizers, men. And the second question has to do with the idea of commemorations and monuments, have to do with the second question, how space policies were created and also territorialization was promoted by metropolis, and how they express the memory of capitalism, of imperial capitalism. They can be seen in different manners, commemorations, and they reveal in different ways. On the one hand, we have the specialization and territorialization. They appear as a colonial space that is appropriated in an arbitrary way since the beginning until the end, and where the commemoration must be done, and also where the monuments have to be built. So there is an arbitrary process of occupation, of imposing the colonial monuments in the space, to create new spaces for these references that must be, and also to create. And another thing that it is important for the memory of capitalism that shows for specialization and also the territorialization policies have to do with the way of how local populations are used to produce this space. Capitalism, imperial capitalism, use the role of local populations to produce the same resources and references that do not have to do with local populations, but have to do with the machinery of the imperial domination and the actors of these. And the third question, the monuments and also the commemorations really showcase very well how they are responded today, because they are perpetuating these figures, these references, and these references today are references that are insist on the idea that the history must be commemorated, must be repeated, must be celebrated by the subjects, by the individuals that are in a way victims of the inequality processes that the capitalism, imperial capitalism created, but also those individuals and the subjects that are victims of this long-lasting history of a capitalist exploration and imperial are subjects looking for these public figures that occupy the public space as reference figures that must belong to the cosmology of memory and mnemonic cosmology. Therefore, to understand imperial capitalism and to understand the memory of capitalism in a broader manner, we must look to these objects and also to know the vestiges of these already exist and how they build new violent histories, and also that really naturalize this violence in the end, and how we must or they can carry on being something to celebrate. Therefore, we must understand this counter memory and also how legacies in these public spaces, it is a new way to us to better look and to observe how capitalism offered us this legacy, and this something still today creates loads of disputes that have nothing to do with the object in itself, but also a dispute for us to understand the genealogy of a series of violence that were naturalized and racism processes of contemporary genealogy that began in colonialism and also created other processes and some nuances and inequality genealogies in contemporary times that were created through the way in which imperial capitalism produced histories in a very sliced and disrupted manner. Thank you very much, and I hope that I didn't went beyond my time. Thank you.
Pelas tuas considerações, tuas excelentes considerações. Eh, o- Ansiosa para fazer alguns comentários.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We now move to the comments. I'll give the floor to Celeste Muñoz for her presentation. After that, we will have a Q&A. Thank you so much, Celeste, for accepting our proposal for this seminar, for the invitation to talk to us about the memories of capitalism and
Gracias
colonialism.
a
Thank
vosotros
you
por
very
la
much.
invitación y pues voy a empezar con la intervención.
Now,
Primero, pues extender a
I'll
todo
begin
el
with my
agradecimiento
presentation.
por
I'd like to
por la
express,
invitación y además
first and
creo que mi
foremost,
intervención se va a complementar muy bien con
my
con la
gratitude,
de Víctor,
and I think my presentation will
que ha elaborado,
complement
¿no? Esta
Victor's
construcción
presentation,
de cómo
who
se
drafted
construyen esas
this
memorias coloniales y
construction
la
of
función,
how
¿no? Y las
these colonial
clasificaciones
memories
de
are
estos
built up,
monumentos.
the functioning and
Y yo en
classification of
realidad
such monuments.
lo que tengo previsto
And in my
es
presentation,
hablar de la deconstrucción de
I'm
estas
planning to
memorias
discuss the
coloniales,
deconstruction
la
of
deconstrucción de estas
such
memorias coloniales a
memories,
través de fenómenos
colonial
actuales como la
memories, and
iconoclastia y la
their
contestación a este tipo
deconstruction.
de
If you think
monumentos.
of
Creo que
iconoclastic
esto me
and the
permite compartir algunas
contestation to
reflexiones
such
porque
monuments,
creo que, y
we can then
intentando
share some insights
responder a lo largo de la intervención a todas las
and
preguntas
trying
que
to
se han planteado,
answer all the questions
porque
from my
creo que debemos
presentation.
considerar que la construcción de las
I
actuales
think that we
memorias,
have
que
to
voy a denominar
consider the
anticoloniales,
building of the so-called
debe
memories,
ser
the anti-colonial
clave
memories.
para la comprensión de lo que podríamos también
This should be an
definir
access
como
for
memorias del
understanding what
anticapitalismo,
we
¿no?
can
Y
define
esto lo
as
voy a tratar de
anti-capitalism memories.
elaborar a
And I
través
will
de
try to elaborate
reflexiones
on that
frutos de recientes
through
investigaciones en
insights
curso sobre
based on
fenómenos
recent
actuales, ¿no?
research
Como la
studies
llamada justicia
on
histórica,
current events
que se
like the
está
so-called
que está tomando, ¿no?
historic
Digamos, el relevo a lo que sería memorias del
justice,
colonialismo, yendo
which
un
is
paso más
taking over
allá
from
a intentar
colonial
elaborar
memories, and
políticas
it's
de
going
reparación y
beyond
políticas
the
de
extra
memoria
mile to
sobre estos pasados.
develop
Y en las
repair
que el espacio
policies
público
and
está
memory
adquiriendo
policies
una
based
enorme
on this
centralidad
on the past
y
time,
ojo,
and the public
conceptos con
space
los que
is
creo que todos
becoming
estamos
central.
familiarizados,
And the
como podría ser
concepts that we
esta
are all familiar
expresión,
with,
la
for
necesidad de
example, this
descolonización del
phrase,
espacio
the
público,
need
¿no? Y los
to
retos y
decolonize the
problemas que
public
todo esto
spaces,
está
challenges,
planteando.
and all the issues that arise from it.
Estos debates somos conscientes que emergen
These
a nivel
discussions, we are
global,
aware that this discussion
que
emerged
emergen, ¿no?
globally.
Para tratar de reflexionar sobre los legados y
They
las
emerged to try
consecuencias de este
to reflect
colonialismo,
on
pero que en
legacies and
realidad
the
están
impact
expresando
of
también un
colonialism,
conflicto de memorias
but they're also
antitéticas
expressing a
que promueven no
conflict of
solo una
anti-thetic
visión
memories
sobre el
that
pasado, sino
promote not
también sobre el
only a
presente, ¿no?
specific view on the past
Esta
time, but also on the
antitesis
present
podría ser,
time.
como ha señalado
This
Víctor, ¿no?
anti-thetic memory, as
El
Victor
orgullo
said,
imperial como parte de la
could be
construcción
the
nacional,
imperial pride
pero
as part
también
of the national
este
construction,
tipo de
but
monumentos
also the
se está
impunity of
visibilizando también
this
como una
dominance of these
legitimación
monuments. It's
completa
also seen
a la
as
estructura
an
capitalista con
complete
recientes
impunity to the capital
formas
system
de referirse a
with
ello, por ejemplo,
reasons
el concepto de
recent
capitalismo
ways
racial
to
o
address it. For
capitalismo
example, the concept of
imperial,
racial
cuyos
capitalism
agentes que están
or
promoviendo
imperial
esta reflexión
capitalism,
crítica con
and
el
the agents
pasado
that are
se perciben
promoting
como
this
víctimas no de un
critical
agravio
review
pasado,
from the
sino de
past,
un
they
agravio
perceive as victims
presente
not
o
of
presente, ¿no? De
past
una forma de desigualdad.
grievances, but current grievances in a way of
La cuestión del espacio
inequality.
público está adquiriendo una enorme centralidad, ¿no?
History
En
justice,
cómo
how
debemos
the occupation of
afrontar
public
estos
space
legados
becoming
que viven
central
en
in the
este
way we
territorio y
face
cómo
these
esta
legacies
impugnación se está
that
realizando a través de
survive
dos
in this
vías.
space,
Por
and
un
how
lado,
these impugnations
la
taking
cuestión esta del
place
surgimiento de un concepto
in
de
two ways.
capitalismo racial o
There
imperial
is the
que a través de la
emergence
impugnación
of
a
the
todos estos
imperial
legados
capitalism,
ponían el
and
centro,
when
¿no? En
these
desigualdades
legacies
actuales derivadas de
impugnated,
agravios del
they are
pasado
challenged.
colonial
it leads to current inequalities and not grievances of the colonial past, and also the emergence or storytelling on nostalgic stories. It's a reaction to those paradigms, and at the same time, they were expressed in relation to the present time and not to the past time. They share all these claims through discourses for strengthening migration policies or with racist nuances. To give you an example to illustrate this reality, and I move to the next slide, some images that you may recognize, they are related to the events that took place during Black Lives Matters, during that movement. And the answer is clear. After the racist assassination of Floyd, it was a clear racist assassination. After that, there was a global movement against symbols of colonialism and slavery, and I will discuss the issues later. But basically, they would identify the concept of coloniality as a persistent oppressive structure of racism in the present time. If we look backwards and we think of the emergence of all these post-colonial storytellings in the 70s or 20th century, after the decolonization of the 20th century, there was a clear connection between colonization, the so-called colonization events in the past, and elements such as racism and inequality in the present time. And this underpins a critical anti-capitalist criticism to identify the current gaps, the current social gaps based on a past element. The occupation of public space and what's remembered in the public space has been becoming more and more central. On the other hand, we see this vandalization of monuments and statues, asking for the removal of the monuments. So now right-wing parties are now asking for specific laws and legislations. Vox and the right-wing party, they ask for this new legislation appealing to the migration to justify the need of these policies. In these antithetic expressions of colonial memories, anti-colonial memories, what underpins is the relationship between the past time and the present time on both sides. The expressions of the colonial criticism is associated with these systemic malaise, but they are not derived from Floyd's assassination. I'd like to tell you about a small genealogy in a practice associated with the 12th of October in terms of the public space. Interpreted as an Atlantic memory, it's an element that I like to retake for my conclusions, and this is related to conflict of nationalist memories together or in conflict with anti-colonial memories. And this is also the backbone of the so-called anti-capitalist memory that I call. I will share the most relevant pictures. Celebration of 12th of October, I will elaborate on that. It's the necessary background. You know, set the day as the 12th of October is from 1992. And as Victor said, that was the 4th century. It had to do with the nationalist policies in that period and the role the celebration would play in the monuments to Columbus. They were created for the first time in the Spanish state. They were all created at the end of the 19th century as an element for identity cohesion. But I don't want to focus on the 4th century when this memory started, but I'd rather would like to analyze the objection in 1992. It's year 2 for our context. We know that introduction of this celebration on the calendar has received different names. the Day of Hispanity and the Race, not only in Spain, but also across Latin America. And as of 1980, in 1990, these categories started to be object of a strong questioning, giving rise to proposals that we all know. The most popular one is setting the date of today for the indigenous persistence, or expressions that would reassess and redefine the significance of this date. These examples show counter storytellings associated with the acts for commemoration of the 5th century, and it's clear to understand how a dominant memory was replaced to introduce a counter memory and social criticism to the present time in specific communities. I think it's interesting to discuss the name that the 5th century adopted, the 5th century. 5th century was considered the clash between two worlds. As a proposal from Mexico, Spanish delegation complained about that. They thought that this title would make the conquest invisible and would make the heroes in Latin America. It will be a victimization to the victims of the conquest, and it wouldn't make the violence of such events visible of this colonial period. And there was just a meeting of two different worldviews on how we need to remember that past time. But this proposal didn't satisfy. They didn't want to get offended, and that wasn't the final target for the 5th century. But some CSOs in Latin America rejected the participation in official events. They organized parallel events for commemoration, 1 minute of silence in Peru, demonstrations in Mexico City, the building of the first Assembly of Indigenous Nations, a request to Europe for genocide events that was promoted at the International Criminal Court, asking for repair. But the most relevant thing is what we can see on this picture, something that happened in Chiapas in 1992, which is the destruction of the statue of Diego de Mazariegos, Spanish conqueror. It's interesting because it wasn't only an answer to this new context of colonial criticism and reviewing all these colonial expressions, naturalized expressions in public spaces as a way of monuments expressing a single memory, a projecting memory of that past time, happened in a local conflict between the Zapatistas in the Mexican state and the Zapatist farmers. They chop off the head of the statue, and in this way they would object the policy of the state about land owners. There was a conflict clashing with the celebration of the 5th anniversary, and these elements illustrate the relationship between the past time and the present time in the emergence of these memories, how these memories are not only expressing a review of past storytelling, but also the current impact of what we understand by legacy or how legacies of colonialism are understood. But I'd like to also draw your attention to what happened in Spain, the other picture that you can appreciate in the left bottom corner, it's a small picture from a newspaper. I could remove that and read that from a newspaper. In 1992, in Spain, many things happened. Not only the 5th anniversary of the 5th century celebration, there was the Expo in Seville with events to celebrate the discovery, between brackets, of America, the Olympic Games in Barcelona. The speed train lines and tracks were being developed, and these could be seen as events that do not match. These facilitated the convention of different social struggles that took the streets jointly under platform the Unmasked 1992, that was named Unmasking 1992, the name of the platform. And this element is very relevant because the platform Unmasking 1992 was a joint struggle against the Olympic Games, speculation against the speculation during the Expo, and the climate struggle against the speed train tracks, the apologetic struggle against the 5th century. There was an alliance of anti-racist collective, like constituencies, diasporic constituencies, anti-capitalist constituencies across the country, anarchist associations, socialist associations, minority trade unions in the state, and they organized jointly actions to make all these concerns visible. I won't elaborate on that, but the main event was the occupation of the civil church, where you find well, the place where Columbus was buried. So they were against the Universal Exhibition, against the Olympic Games, and these events were repressed by the state army. They used ammunition. 84 people were detained, and people were expelled from the Spanish territory, applying the recent migration law that was recently passed. The resistance against capitalism, together with the memories of colonialism and how this is expressed in the practice, I think it's an interesting and appropriate discussion item for this seminar. And all this genealogy telling us about events we are very familiar with today, but it's a long-standing history that hasn't been analyzed so far. Some of the recent elements that are made visible in this reality, they are quite recent. The top left corner picture, that's not the one for Antonio Lopez statue, a conflict when the Antonio Lopez statue was moved in Barcelona. This person was associated with slavery trade in the 19th century. After different associations and grassroots movements managed to rebaptize this monument, Idris Adriano was a migrant from Guinea-Conakry that died in Austin Center for Migrants in Barcelona in 2011 in a square that would elevate a slavery trader. Today is named by someone that was a victim of the migration policies. And this is a symbolic space today, hosting demonstrations organized by anti-capitalism associations and different associations. And on the 12th of October, on a yearly basis, they demonstrate against the protest against the presence of the Columbus statue, but also against migration policies and racism. Another picture, I don't want to elaborate on that, but you can see a picture of another demonstration at Columbus Square in Madrid, another contested symbol of colonialism with a sentence fired to the colonial order. And in these demonstrations, we see the same storytellings that I expressed before earlier when I discussed the event that took place at Antonio Lopez Square, or the recent monument to the Legion in the bottom left corner that was open a year and a half, some chronic monument to the Legion, to this army, but it shows how these nostalgic memories are missed, and they still create images to restore the status quo and the victims of the Legion in the Morocco War were remembered, but also the current victims of migration processes and the global impoverishment. The examples from 1992 and current examples are part of a continuum of objection expressions on memories of colonialism, creating all these anti-colonial memories with a discourse that in its genesis includes the concerns of the current time, inequality, legacies of capitalism. And I'd like to make some final remarks as a way of conclusion. If we open this line of research and reflection, these elements could be used, and we need to tackle those issues. Those are the questions I pose, and
Una es
perhaps I don't have enough answers to them. Polysemia of the concept of decolonization. And I think this is a epistemological challenge. It is a long-standing tradition of African, Latin American authors that believe in decolonization after independence. We are very well aware of expressions such as decolonizing museums, decolonizing the public space, decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing everything. And it shows that the colonizing practice still persists in structures, in ways of dominance, current ways of dominance in the present time. We need to think about the use of this concept of decolonizing. And above all, I think this triggers alerts about the current insatisfaction with the modern processes in communities. We need to close the loop because these greater gaps for inequality, translated poverty, and migration policies, they are seen, they are understood as a legacy from colonialism, like developing tool for capitalism itself. The second insight, there is a tension, there is stress between all these movements that are rooted deeply. They are very heterogeneous and they cannot all be categorized as capitalist movements or movements with a specific label. They are heterogeneous, and a great deal of them in their storytelling, they all have an objection to the system that they consider a legacy of colonialism. And considering all these movements and vandalization events against monuments and the heritage restoring, the repair for colonialism, there is a progressive institutionalization of these demands on behalf of the UN, which wish to repair this past time. So said, take this idea, it's depolitizing discussions today, because at the center of the discussion, the key idea is asking for forgiveness, or it's restoring the heritage, but the objections that are rather structural are being ignored instead. And this is a matter that we need to monitor, because this will be a stress scenario if there is a progressive institutionalization of movements to repair. And before I finish, there is the idea of the creation of the so-called Atlantic memories. We know that there is an evident stress between story and history and memory. There are different areas. I don't think they are stagnated. I think this discussion has been overcome back in the 80s and 90s, but there is still a dialogue between history and memory. There are important sections for history, like the distinction between a modern colonial system and the imperial colonial system of the modern ages, the distinction between colonialism and slavery trade, the geographical distinction. In Africa or Latin America, the colonial processes were different. These distinctions, which are relevant to history, they are not being relevant to the diasporic communities or the actors and stakeholders that contribute to the creation of these memories, because the different history experiences are joined in a common storytelling that it is the backbone of an identity against colonialism. And this leads to different insights. So therefore, historians need to ask the following question: how can we equip the society with critical tools to reach wide consensus on the memory conflicts? And if this knowledge is a means to bridge a gap, there is a consent I don't want to elaborate on. It's also the emergence of reactive options that revitalize all these imperial storytelling that are also using the colonial pastime in their political materials. And with these three insights, I conclude my presentation. I open for discussion, and hopefully I didn't exceed in my time. And apologies for the technical glitches that we had early on because of my PowerPoint presentation. Thank you so much, Celeste. Thank you so much. We run out of time, and Victor must leave now. Can you, Victor, hear me for a minute only, if I may? Yes, please, go ahead. And briefly, just 1 minute, if you can listen to me, and after that, I will make a remark to Celeste. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. Many questions were posed about what we think about memories of capitalism in this imperial dimension and colonial dimension. To think about historicism of memory itself, we need to think that it's not only about memorial ways or memorial processes that change over time. Mainly, I love something in your presentation. It was about the language aspect of the process for the capitalism memory. Some terms, expressions, and figures are not being naturalized over time. I know that you have to leave now, but hopefully we can have a chat another time to discuss all these issues. I hope so too. Thank you so much for your remarks and apologies for the inconvenience. I must leave this place, so my apologies, but I think that we will have a chance to keep on having a dialogue. I love Celeste's presentation, and I think that we will have a chance together with other colleagues that are sitting at the table to develop this dialogue and to exchange more messages and to keep on reflecting. If you have any questions in relation to my presentation, please email it to me and I will individually answer each and every one of you. Apologies, and I think that I shared the main elements. And if you wish, you can ask questions, send them over to me, and I will do my best to answer them. And it's been a pleasure to take part in this seminar. Thank you so much. Good evening, and keep up the good work. See you again soon. We can continue. Victor's presentation was drawing our attention to the memories of capitalism and to the intrinsic dimension of capitalism. It's not only about exploration, but also about the expropriation. In this event, in the colonial and imperial event, it's about
and also the expropriation of the past and the relationship
with
the
past,
temporality dimensions, as well as expressions of time, and also how everything was imposed in a single manner or
that seems a
allegedly unique
in
with
terms
this
of the
relation
relationship
with
to the
time. This is very important,
Those are
the
important conclusions
perspective of Victor's,
Victor's
and also
presentation,
the
and the
idea
idea that the
the
presence
presence
of
of
these
these
statues and monuments and
statues
celebrations
and
in the public
commemorations in the
space,
public
they
sphere
support the
help the
naturalization of these
naturalization and
images,
the
of
acceptance
these
of
words
words,
and
images, people,
and they
characters
contribute to
that little by little
depoliticizing.
contribute towards depolitization and a certain naturalization of the presents and homages that were imposed in reality. Therefore, we can go back to Carolina's presentation when she talked about the oblivion processes operated by capitalism, the oblivion of the processes that led to this capitalistic perspective and the making of capitalism. I think that both presentations are interrelated, therefore it's very important to bring back this idea. As for Celeste, this proposal, when we still think about historicity of a memory, I loved the idea of 1892, like year zero for the memories. Christopher Columbus, how much the 12th October as well. To us, it's something natural. It is something that we incorporated in our culture, commemorating 12th of October. Well, we believe that since the first 12th of October, 1492, we celebrate it, but the environment is completely different right now. and this date was selected from a different perspective and in a different period in time. Therefore, this concept of year zero to denaturalize and to deconstruct this memory, and also to have an anti-colonial memory, which is also an anti-capitalistic memory, which is also a relationship that I did appreciate a lot. And also in your presentation, you contributed a lot to have a critical perspective. And also, you underline the idea that everything is dealt from the present, not trying to repair everything from the past, but also we dealt with this moment in time to modify towards the future, in a future where we'll be able to propose new changes, initiatives, as well as other transformation systems from now onwards. So to be more concrete and specific, not only from the optical of symbol alterations and modifications, but also social changes as well. Therefore, I do believe that this should be one of the most important perspectives when dealing with memories of politics, and also this need to reconquer present and future as the places and moments to appropriate ourselves from the political perspective, not only thinking of the past, but memory as a critical tool to react in today's time and in the future. So congratulations for your great presentation. If possible, I'd like to know a little bit more about this Atlantic memory. I think that this is a very interesting perspective because it was something that you brought to the table. It was brought to the table, this idea of the Atlantic history, when we thought about the relationship between the American, European, African continent, this dynamic that was created since the 15th century. But how can we build this memory network from an Atlantic perspective, a transcontinental memory in the end, and how do you see this perspective of this Atlantic history?
Caroline, por las consideraciones. Bien, voy a empezar
Thank
con
you
la
very
última
much,
pregunta, que
Carolina,
es
for
específicamente
your
una,
comments. Well,
cuestión
I'm
así
going to
de
start
1992 como
with the last question. However, I'd
pero
like to
creo que
talk
mi
about
concepto de
1992 as a
colonial
year zero, but I think that the
atlántica
Spitman
y
was the
actualmente
one
es
that
una
created the concept of the
extensión
Atlantic
la teoría
history.
de la historia
And
global que como
today,
está usted diciendo,
inside
incluso
this
hay quien dice que es
emergence of
una
global history, it is a context that we can see everywhere, and some people say that
la
we are
crítica
abusing
que
of
se
it.
hace a la intención de hacer una historia global o una historia de
The
Europa
criticism that we make once we create a global or regional history, it is the invisibilization of different territory or memories in favor of a single narrative. I think that we must bear this in mind, but at the same time, this will make possible not to conceptualize the Atlantic space in a way that is a long-lasting space, not only in the past with slave trafficking, people trafficking, but also a way where ideas circulated and also different political systems circulated in the past as well. And today, 12th of October made me think and to go deeper in order to analyze this Atlantic memory, because the 12th of October, it's not a memory of the Spanish states. 12th October, it's a commemoration that it's officially stated in all the Hispanic America region. It stems from very similar approaches, and in today's critics, in this counter memory, there is like a flaw in the ideas, in the way we build these ideas, that it's especially impacted through the diasporic communities, through migrant movements, but today we must say crystal clear through the flows of social media and networks and so on and so forth. And in 1992, the platform Let's Show 1992, that platform had loads of meeting and reunions with authors in Latin America that try to, well, go against this uh, celebration. And this would allow us to create, in this regard, an Atlantic memory. And it's also very interesting to realize that in this counter reaction, there is like a counterpart as well. Once we analyze the nostalgia, colonial nostalgia through right-wing parties that are very nostalgic, that they are aiming at vindicating the past empires through different legislations promoting the recuperation of the glory of the empire. I could quote you many cases, but they are also having a dialogue with some stakeholders and actors. I'm thinking, let's say, about Marcelo Gullo and many other nostalgic expressions that, well, are always interrelated with what we can experience here in Spain. So this concept of Atlantic memory, to understand better our context, it's very useful in the end. I don't know if I answered to your questions. But as for 1992, well, that issue, like the 0 year where everything began, well, it didn't come out of the blue, 1992. There was a tradition behind the scenes, mainly in Latin America, different movements. Of course, the Zapatista movement in 1992, they thought about colonialism as well. But in that specific conflict, there is the confluence and the collision of some traditions. Many things collide, and also the ownership of land, private property as well, as a consequence of decolonialism and fighting for the property of land, belongs to the genealogy of the past in order to place in day-to-day perspective, but also commemorating and having to make a commemoration in all the countries must were implied under the UNESCO directive. There was a transnational reflection that also allowed to unite different communities that had different perspectives that were not able to dialogue amongst them. And from that moment on, they were able to be more united in a more obvious way. And also the state was, well, here in Spain, we are getting rid of the Franco times with this economic sword that we experienced with the Olympic Games and the Universal Exhibition. But also, well, it was a fight, and also Lucrecia Perez was murdered. It's considered the first racist murder in Spain that opened the door to an anti-colonial memory and also the decolonization of a museum. In a Catalan museum, there was a bushman that was dissected, right? And there was violence in the museums representing racism as well. So many things happened that year. It's very interesting to go deeper and to better analyze that year, because when I explored the newspapers and the news, I realized that there was only a single article published about the genealogy, and just a single article that dealt with all these connections that were possible in 1992. Therefore, this is quite a very interesting line to carry on studying. Yes. In our city, in Porto Alegre, in the commemorative context of the 50th century of the discovery, someone proposed to build a clock with a countdown backwards for the day of the discovery. And that clock, well, was attacked, was destroyed, or it was burned with the idea to say, this is not our time. This commemoration doesn't belong to us. All right, Celeste, thank you so much. Thank you very much for your great contribution and for your presentation. I'd like to invite you to stay with us